And I said, oh, that one's bigger. Yes. But this one has bop, 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 bop. And I named all the things I saw that I thought made it an old tree. Trees don't read textbooks. I think that's a fact we can all agree on. Most people assume that big trees are old, but what we really find, and there are always exceptions because this is ecology and biology, is that the big trees are big because they're fast growing.
We have a sponsor for this episode of Apple Finch Pudding. But before I delve into this, I want to be very clear about what this sponsorship is being used for. This sponsorship is being used to support the podcast. This means buying subscriptions to software we need, maybe some editing, or buying some other material that will benefit the podcast. That being said, our sponsor for this episode is Size Summary. As researchers, we need to read a lot of papers, and more are being published every day. As a result, reading papers is becoming more or less a full-time job, leaving us virtually with no time to do our actual jobs, which is research. This is where Size Summary comes in. Size Summary provides you with an AI-based summary of the papers you provide. However, Size Summary is much more than just a summarizing tool. It lets you chat with your papers. You can ask questions, for example, like what material and methods are being used, but it can also provide you with insights as to what would be good avenues for future research based on the papers you provide. If you want to try out Size Summary for yourself, there's a link in the description below. If you use this link, you can have a 7-day free trial. However, if you want to go for a paying subscription, don't forget the code based on this podcast, which is AFP25. So AFP stands for Apple Finch Pudding 25, because you will get 25% off on your subscription. Go definitely check it out. See if it's something you like. If you like it, please go for it. But for now, let's go back to the show. Welcome to Apple Finch Pudding, your gateway into the world of science. Today's scientist is Neil Pederson, a senior ecologist at Harvard University. He investigates the dynamics and the long-term development of forest by using tree rings. Welcome, Neil.
Thanks. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here, Jeroen.
Before we start, do you have a fun science fact for our listeners?
Yeah, I do actually. And it's trees don't read textbooks. I think that's a fact we can all agree on. And it's a joking thing I came up with some time ago when I do my public lectures, and I thought this would be a good place to start. And it's more of a metaphor of like how or what we know about trees today. So in the US, in North America, actually, we have this book called the Silvics Manual of North America. And in that, there are, as many tree species as possible. And there's all this information there, to learn about trees. Like you grow here, you grow with them, you do not like shade, you do better in fire than them. And so we have categorized trees. We've placed them in these ways of knowing about them from a Western science perspective. And I'm only talking about Western science perspective. And I love these manuals. I love the Silvics of North America. After my master's degree, my first job as a technician, I devoured them because I was applying what I had learned and working with new species because I was in a different part of the Eastern US. And so I read them, and maybe not all of it, but I read a lot and I relied upon it and I loved it. And so fast forward to my dissertation and I start coring trees in Eastern North America. And I noticed quickly that I was starting to core trees that were much older than what the Silvics manual said. The maximum age of cucumber magnolia is seldom over 150 years. Well, the second one I ever cored was 337 years, doubled that. And it wasn't that I knew what I was doing. I was young. I didn't know what I was doing. I was just studying a species from a tree ring perspective that maybe had not been studied before. And so that was cool. And then in the subsequent 20 years, I've been finding individual trees that are more shade tolerant, can live in the understory much longer than what the Silvics manual would say. And during my dissertation, I learned that trees could grow at their maximum ages or near their maximum ages at rates that were higher than any other point in their lives, which is exactly the opposite of what we learned in forestry school. And so then I joke about it. Trees, don't read textbooks. They don't adhere to the categories that we have put them in. And I don't mean to dismiss a century of research or more of Western science research and the hard work that went into the civics manual and the other work that people do. I laughed about it a lot in my talks, but now in the last few years, I'm like, oh, I got to really respect the work that came before me. And it wasn't that I was disrespectful, but it could come off that way. And what we're realizing, the fact is, we need to learn a lot more about our trees. And what we're learning, at least in my research group, but I'm sure it's happening in any other groups that are studying trees, is that we are making scientific progress since the Silvics manual, right? So it's been 30 years. That's a lifetime of a scientist, a research scientist. And so we hope that we will learn something new in 30 years. And that's what we're doing. So the fact is, trees don't read textbooks. And the fact is that trees can do more things than we might have imagined just 20 and 30 years ago.
But I think it's also something very human. Like we always want to put things in bins, but
Yeah.
nature doesn't allow itself to be pushed in bins.
Right, exactly. I love that because I went to forestry school and I think a lot about management, though I don't do any and I don't get involved right now with that. But just being able to see the plasticity, the individualistic nature of trees, and thinking back to Leon Neal, he's a forester who has passed away. I met him when he was really old, and he was the most amazing forester. And his type of forest management confounded scientists because it wasn't categories, it wasn't bins, it wasn't a regular rotation. And he said, I just go out there and I look at the trees and I think about them and then I make decisions. And and so so that's why I itch a little about categorization of trees, but also to think about it more, to think about the lives of trees. Trees are living beings just like you and me, and just like everyone else who's listening to this. And and we do all we can to survive, right? I mean, survive for humans is on the basic needs, but then we have other dreams and hopes and wishes. And I'm not going to try to make trees like people because they're not like people. They're amazing. People are amazing too, but in a different way. But trees are trying to survive. I mean, right? That's no different than anything else. So if you're a chestnut oak and you're in the understory under a eastern hemlock, you're not going to give up the ghost if you don't have to. And so the the oldest documented chestnut oak, the one that really started me thinking about what do we know about the lives of trees, was in the understory for like 300 years. And I maybe it popped up a little bit when it was 250 years old. I caught it when it was 427 years old. And I don't know when it exactly made it into the canopy, but I think it was in the understory for 3 centuries. And I'm sure that's not expected of this species. So I'm talking about individual trees violating our conceptions of trees. And so, you could critique my critique, but I think that's at the level that evolution and ecology works at. I mean, we think about larger scales. I think about larger scales of forests and trees, but individuals matter.
Most people think like the biggest trees are the oldest trees, but there are stories like small spruce trees that are living in the shade and it's like a century old. And once there's a gap of light, it like sprints towards the gap to grow. But they are really old and really small at the beginning, and that's insane.
Yeah, and you just hit on one of the main memes I might have, I guess, in my career. I wrote a paper 14 years ago about what do old trees look like? Because I was giving talks then, but more, I was in the forest one day with a well-trained, highly trained forest ecologist in the region. I was living in Kentucky at that time. And I said, well, we're going to core that tree, but we won't core that tree. And he goes, why? And I said, oh, that one's bigger. Yes. But this one has bop, 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 bop. And I named all the things I saw that I thought made it an old tree. And it's not my discovery. David Staley, Ed Cook, Tom Sweat, and Peter Brown, Laura Huckabee, they have papers, and I've talked to them about what old trees look like. And I was just in a new region looking at a new set of trees. So it wasn't that I was discovering anything. And my colleague said, well, you should write that down. And I said, really? And he goes, yeah, because I didn't know that. And most people assume that big trees are old, but what we really find, and there are always exceptions because this is ecology and biology, is that the big trees are big because they're fast growing. They have large crowns, so they intercept a lot of sunlight for photosynthesis, but they also have likely really big root systems, so they're soaking up, mopping up a lot of water and nutrients, and they're just great competitors. So quite often the biggest trees are often very fast growing. Now maybe they were suppressed in the understory for a while, and then they were released, as you said, they were exposed to the sun and they grew really fast. But the big trees are often fast growing and not very old. And so the oldest trees almost around the world, I think, but at least in the eastern United States, are often middling size. They're often just average size. Most people would walk by them. And it's because of what you said, competition. Though in other parts of the world, it's because they're living in very cold environments, or they're living in very hot environments, or very dry environments. And like humans and mice and a lot of other things, it seems to be that slow growth rates lend themselves to greater lifespans.
You also mentioned that you had some characteristics that you're looking for in the field to see what trees are old. What are those
Yeah.
characteristics?
Yeah, so initially I look at the bark and the pattern of the bark. When you get a book of tree identification or tree ID, um, the pictures of bark that they show you in those books, at least in the eastern United States, are often, to my eyes, 20 to 40-year-old trees. And when trees are able to live 200, 300, 400 years, their bark changes dramatically. So much so that sometimes they're almost unrecognizable by the bark. There's a good book called Bark. It's focused more in North America and the Northeast, I think, and it talks a little bit about that. And the author gets to the idea of how bark changes with age. And so bark is one thing I look for. Some balding of the bark might be a sign of age, but you know, men bald at young ages, so that's actually not the best characteristic for me anymore. I look at stem taper. And if a tree, it's appropriate that we're approaching Christmas. If a tree is shaped like a conifer, like a Christmas tree, it tends to be younger than if it was more like a telephone pole. So if the stem taper from the base of the tree to just below the crown, if it's more like a pole rather than a triangle, that tends to be an older tree. I like to look at more and more. Actually, now I'm looking in the canopy more for age. And if it's a hardwood or a broadleaf species, oak or maple, beech, if it has a few branches that are large, relatively larger and twisty in the top of the canopy, but it doesn't have a lot of branches, and if there are a few leaves on those branches, that's usually a sign of a slower growing tree, which also lends itself to an older tree. Now, in conifers, that characterization is a little bit different. It's called flat top. So the trees grow up to a certain height. They lose that triangle force that's called apical dominance, and they become flat topped. So first we look for flat-topped conifers, and then sometimes in arid regions, especially, they'll have the leader has died back. So there's been some harsh conditions in drought or lightning strike or something like that, and has killed back the top of the crown a little bit. But there's a spike of dead wood above the living crown, and we call that spike top. And we look for those things. I think that's most of what I look at. I look at the amount of biomass that's high in the tree. That's really what I look at now because I think it takes a long time to get a lot of wood 20 to 30 to 40 meters above the ground, 20 to, 30 to 70, 80 feet above the ground. I think that takes a long time. So I'm really look more at the top of the tree. I use bark as a clue. Oh, there's one other one that I just remembered. Quite often, the oldest trees aren't actually straight, like a telephone pole. They will have low stem taper, but they'll be sinuous. They'll twist their way into the crown. And this is more broadleaf species, which is what I study more, and not all trees, but I look for this sinuosity. It looks like a snake trying to climb a tree. That's what they kind of remind me of. And I really like that trait. And it's not 100%. None of these are 100% because biology is so complicated. But if you start to get a tree with one, two, three, or four of these external characteristics, you could be in front of a really old tree. Size does not equal age, and canopy status does not equal age. Cored, I cored a chestnut oak that was still in the understory. I forgot about this tree, but I remember it was 310 years old. It wasn't much wider than me. I'm not a big person. Okay. I don't know how tall I am in meters. Sorry. But I'm just 5'7". And it was not a big tree, but had all the traits that I describe in the paper, and it was 310 years old, and it hasn't reached a canopy yet. So yeah, you have to study trees and think about them to start to identify them. People now ask me how old a tree is, and I've been tricked and fooled so many times. Still, I don't give an answer anymore.
We've talked a lot now about the age of trees and coring, but so coring is actually what it says. You take a core of a tree and you look at the tree rings. But maybe what are tree rings? Because everybody knows tree rings, but what are they exactly?
Yeah, that's a good question because I've never really thought about that. That's not my scale of expertise, but I think it's interesting to think about. Tree rings are the basically the expansion of cells around the stem of the tree, just inside the bark. I don't mean to anthropomorphize trees. I don't mean to do that because I think trees are just so different. But to help people understand trees a little bit more, it's a very useful thing. And so to me, tree rings are also a kind of memory of the tree's life, right? So trees are I mean, I know everyone knows this, but we got to say it. Trees are sessile. They can't move. So if you're sitting there and you're a successful tree and you live 200, 300, 400,000 years, you have to stand there when there's fire and drought and frosts and windstorms and ice. And that's an amazing thing to think about. But all those injuries of time happens to you and me and deer and whales and everyone else. They kind of influence how the tree adapts and how it responds and how it utilizes the energy that it's creating in the leaves and distributes it in different parts of the tree, maybe from year to year and from season to season, depending on what's happening outside of it. The swirling environment that constantly forces trees to adapt. And so, in the end result, ring width where we core trees, just 1.4 meters above the ground, 4.5 feet. In the old days, that used to be called secondary growth, so the primary energy went to leaves and roots and other processes. And then leftover energy got put around the stem. So that's highly simplistic and it's not fully accurate. But the idea is when there are good years, more growth will occur at the base of the tree where we core it. And tough years, drought, frost, fire, anything that injures the tree, there'll be less growth at the base of the tree. And so what we do as tree ring scientists, we can identify the ring patterns through time. We could put calendar dates on each ring. We don't count rings, we cross date them. We put calendar dates accurately, precisely, and then we can read the life of that tree. We can interpret, not 100%. We don't know everything that's going on because trees are enormously complex. But a tree ring is a kind of record, a memory of what's happened in the environment.
And you said you use those tree rings but you cross date them, so you put actual dates on them. But that's not always that easy. For example, some trees don't have tree rings, or they can have multiple in 1 year. Can you
Yeah.
give us some insights on that?
I can give you too much insight on that. Let me tell you. So people have known that tree rings respond to the trees respond to the environment, and the changes in the environment influence the width of the ring. They've known this for 2,000 years, probably 5,000 years, probably 10,000 years. We shouldn't sell our ancestors short at all. But we know Pliny the Elder and, all the old timers, they knew that. Da Vinci knew this. Everyone knew. A lot of people knew this who looked at trees and thought about trees. But A.E. Douglas, in about 120 years ago, finally, a little more than that, finally saw that what you can see is this pattern of large and small rings through time. And it was common among the population of ponderosa pine that he was looking at. And then he said, we can cross date. We can put calendar dates on each and every ring. And the idea was basically that we've learned that the hard years produce narrow rings, and that's more consistent in a population of trees than the good years. So the way I teach it sometimes is if we had a little, if we had a population of people and we let them eat anything they wanted all day every day for 2 months, some people would gain a substantial amount of weight. Some people might not gain much, and we would not like that person very much unless they were charming, right? We'd be really jealous. We're like, how do you eat all that food and then still be so fit, like, how? But if we put everyone on a diet of like water and crackers, which I don't recommend, people would lose weight. And I'm not saying good or bad in terms of weight, but just the outcome of the process. If we went about our normal daily lives, some people would lose more weight than others, but most of us would lose weight. It's the same, almost the same thing with trees. So when there's a drought, more trees grow less than if there was a wet year, and some trees grow more, some grow middling. The diversity of growth during wet years, let's say, is much more than the diversity during small years. And so we can identify those rings and we can place calendar dates, and it's like testing a hypothesis. Then we go core other trees and we say, is this pattern the same among trees? It's hypothesis testing. And so that seems pretty straightforward, except in the tropics where the seasons are not as strong at the mid and higher latitudes, like down in South America and South Africa, or up in here in the mid latitudes, Germany, United States, up to Canada, Russia, all those, and Asia, all those places. I've not done work in the tropics, but sometimes that really subtle change from one season to another makes it very difficult to see the transition from one ring into the next. And sometimes trees might not form a good transition. But I'm telling you, there are people I've seen now in Colombia, Brazil, that are doing incredible work that I would say Northern Hemisphere scientists didn't think was possible 30 years ago. So, like, we're making incredible, incredible strides. But then some years when they're really hard in trees that do produce nice rings that we can see, sometimes they don't form a ring all the way around the tree. If it's a really dry year or a very severe frost, maybe a ring isn't actually formed on one side of the tree where we happen to core it. And so knowing the pattern of large and small rings through time helps us find what we call missing rings or locally absent. They're just not there on that side of the stem. And so that makes it a lot harder. But I want to tell you, Jeroen, that here in the northeastern United States, and I'm sure it's true in parts of Europe, and I know it's true in Asia, and I those are the places I'm most familiar with. It's even harder than that. I'm looking at a forest that's dominated by oak right now, but we have red maples in this forest that are in the understory, and I found it was over 20 years ago that some suppressed red maples were missing 5, 7, 9, 15 rings on the outside of the tree because they were so overtopped by the big, fast growing oaks. They weren't getting a lot of light. They were being outcompeted below ground and above ground. And my advisor, Kevin Griffin, I told him about this, and he goes, "Well, are those trees alive?" And I said, "Well, yeah, they had leaves on them. They must be zombies," is what I said. And so I've come up with this idea of zombie maples, and it's the idea that trees can sit in the understory and persist and live, but maybe not grow at the base of the stem. They're shunting all their energy that we just talked about to the leaves and to the roots just to live, just to survive, not to grow so much. That was the first thing that really was hard for me to learn, and now we've seen it in other species. But now we're studying sugar maple, the tree that makes beautiful color and maple syrup, and one of the most important trees in the Northeast. And when I talked about individualistic trees 10 minutes ago, sugar maple and yellow birch here in the northeastern United States are some of the most individualistic trees I've ever worked with. So that pattern of finding large and small rings through time, that's kind of easy in the southwestern United States and semi-arid environments. I've not done much research down there, but I did a lot of work in Mongolia, which is a very similar environment. Cross dating there is ridiculously easy once you have five or six trees. It's almost boring. I mean, I don't I did that work. I'm not diminishing the work that people are doing, but I'm telling you, compared to the work that my team is working on now here in the Northeast, it's night and day. It's like every tree is just doing what they can and what they need to be doing to adapt from year to year. And so the pattern, the conformity at the tree level of sugar maple and yellow birch is very low. They're just like they're out doing their own little thing. And when we publish these data, I'm writing a paper on it too to prepare people for this. But when we publish these data, some traditional tree ring scientists are going to look at these and are like, did you even try to cross state? And you're like, yes, yes, people want to quit. This is so hard, like, and it's a really difficult process. And this difficulty, I think, lends itself sometimes when people look at a stump and then they say it's 500 years old. You can't know that unless you're cross dating. And so it's hard to see these rings. That makes it really hard. And then when trees are doing individualistic things or when they're under really harsh growing conditions and they're not forming rings, that makes this whole process really difficult. And I didn't realize this 20 years ago, but boy, the last decade, it's another level. But it's fun because to me, that's where the ecology is. It's in the variation of individual trees. Some will succumb to climate change more than others, I think, because of how they're responding in an individualistic nature, based on where they're living.
Something short that we didn't mention before. You collect this data by coring, but the coring is not harmful to the trees.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, thank you for that. And I can just say really quickly, sadly, there's one tree that has probably been cored, we don't know, 8 to 13 times over 40 years. And the last time it was cored, I cored it. It's the oldest documented pitch pine. I cored it as a part of a teaching project. It was growing faster at 400 years of age than at any other point of its life. And so even though we know of 3 or 4 times, but maybe 8 or 9 cores over the last 40 years taken from this tree, growth is not slowing down at all. And we see this a lot. And we also know along the same way, people have done studies of cored trees versus uncored trees in the same forest. And there's no differences in mortality rates. We might be increasing heart rot and sugar maple at a 10% rate. But for almost all the other work that we've done, we really don't see a great impact. And that comes back to the idea that trees have to survive in a hard environment for 200, 300, 400 years. So they have natural defenses like we do. They're just very different. They're not vulnerable. Well, everyone's vulnerable, but they're not uh they've they've evolved to adapt to woodpeckers and ice storms and windstorms and salt spray. So our single core or two cores per tree once in their lifetime typically Doesn't it's like a biopsy when we give tissue to have it to be diagnosed for something. It's very similar. Trees are tough. They're resilient.
And imagine you have your course. What are you able to get out of it? I assume it's more than just tree age.
It is much more than tree age. One of my silly things I say sometimes is like, well, they can answer any question you have, which is
Okay.
clearly overstating it. But I wanted to turn this back to you for a second. I think it would be fun. Like, what are you curious about learning? But maybe what are your friends or family curious about learning in terms of the environment and or trees? What questions have you heard that people are curious about?
Yeah, one of the main things is I think regarding climate change, like is climate changing and is it changing faster than in the past, for
Mm.
example?
Right. We can answer that with tree rings. We can, there are studies going back, I know at least back to the 60s, but probably even early, where tree rings have been used, first at small scales, now at northern hemispheric scales, and southern hemispheric as well, where we can go to particular locations, sample particular trees that we know are likely to be sensitive to the temperature in their environment. So during a cool summer and maybe a cool winter, a cold winter, they would grow less, and vice versa. Warm years, they would grow more generally. It's not perfect, it's biology, but we would collect those trees. What we do is we compare them to temperature records from the area, from the region, and we get the relationship between warm years and cold years and how the trees grow. It's a mathematical model. We then take that relationship and we basically paste it on to the tree rings that go back in time, and then we can reconstruct temperature going back 200, 300, and now we're gone back 2000 years really well. And so we can say that indeed the warming of the last 150 years are almost unprecedented in the last, 1000 to almost 2000 years. That rate is probably unprecedented. I've not studied the latest papers lately, so don't quote me on all of this. It's getting warmer than it has been in the past. And my guess is the newer records, if they are really strong, they will show what we see in the northern hemisphere, a real acceleration of warming probably since the 80s. And so we can do that with tree rings. We first did it with ringwits, and then very smart people realized that we could look at the cells and look at the density of the wood. And so when it's warmer, the density of the wood in the cells of a year is higher. So warmer, more dense wood, colder, less dense wood. And people are now extracting that information at the cellular level, like visually. They're not getting DNA or anything like that, but people are using isotopes too that's embedded in the wood, and they are making the same relationships and coming up to the same conclusions. And the cellular level analyses, the wood anatomy analyses that are being done are better than the ring width ones that we were using 20, 30, 40 years ago. So, again, more scientific progress. But we can do that about water. Was it a rainy year? Was it a wet year? Ed Cook he made first the North American Drought Atlas, where you can go online, you can download data for your backyard, not exactly your backyard, for your region, and you can see how wet and dry it's been for the last 300 to 2000 years. But of course, Ed, being Ed, has now made it for Europe and for Asia and Australia and South America. Africa is the last, and the tropics are the last regions where there will be drought atlases, but we have drought atlases that cover the mid and high latitudes for the entire globe. It's an amazing accomplishment. And that's all from tree rings, and it's from hardworking scientists. It wasn't just Ed Cook, it's a lot of people putting this together. So we can learn about that. And I'm sure people are worried about forest fires. And so we can go to places. Fires come by these sessile trees, they scar the wood. We can find these scars, we could take samples, and we can reconstruct the fire history going back in time. all across the United States is an important question because colonizing settler culture changed how forests were stewarded from indigenous people. And so we would like to get back to what is likely a much better stewardship style. I think it is. And one way we can do that is reconstructing fire and learning how it was and talking to people. The most important thing is to talk to people and learn these things, but we can learn it some from trees as well. We can learn about insect defoliations. We can learn about earthquakes, trees sitting on faults. When there's a big earthquake, the top of the crown branch breaks out, they lose branches, the roots get ripped up a little bit, but they survive. And we can identify earthquakes that had happened in the past that are not recorded, that are not written records, you know. There's rock slides and snow avalanche, and I mean, there's just so many things. And then there's the whole ecology, like what I do. You know, I joke about, you know, if a tree falls in the woods and there's no one there to observe it, does it actually occur? That's my little joke about that. And we can say, yes, I can reconstruct when neighboring trees of a tree I core died in the past. I can see the change in growth rate. So trees in an understory are growing like this through time. The neighboring trees fall over. They're exposed to the sun, just as you said, you know, 20 minutes ago, and growth immediately shoots up like this. We can identify those exact years and we can reconstruct the disturbance history of the forest at the stand scale, at the landscape scale, and now we're doing it at the regional scale across the northeastern United States. We did it in the southeastern United States, and our initial results challenged the theory of how forests change over time.
I have so many questions,
Yeah.
but the last thing you said was that what you found challenged the dynamics of what we know of the dynamics of forests. What do you mean by that? What was the challenge?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I appreciate that. That's my favorite question these days. So we have a big project that we're working on to address this question, but basically in forestry school and ecology school in the eastern United States, but I think it's probably applicable to all the mid-latitude mesic forests. So when I say mesic, I mean forests that get a certain amount of rain per year, you know, that makes them sort of wet or humid. We don't have a good term. We use the word mesic now. So not wet, not dry, that little nice in between level. We're told, I was taught that in these forests, you normal mortality of trees is 1 to 2 to 3% of the trees die every year at large scales. Now, there are windstorms and ice storms and hurricanes and typhoons that change this mortality rate, but not at large scales. And so at the larger scale, you have this constant turnover of the forest, but it's asynchronous. It's in time and in space. And so that over 400 or 500 years, at the larger scale, the composition and the structure of the forest won't change much because it's just slowly changing. Those small gaps that are being created are quickly filled from trees from below or trees from the side. And so the forest is what we say quasi-equilibrium. Now, people are getting rid of that term and they're moving away from it. But what we found in the southeastern United States was that starting in 1774 and for 6 years, there was a great mortality event. So maybe only 10 or 20% of the forest died, but it died synchronously across forest types, across hemlocks and ravines and oaks on acidic ridges and everything, many places in between. There was a synchronous mortality event at a very large scale, at about, I want to say it's 60,000 square kilometers is what we've traced it to. I should have that number memorized, but it's somewhere in that. It's quite big. And the forest responded synchronously. And what we learned was it was repeated droughts leading up to that, weakening the trees, I think. And then one of the worst frost events in May 4th, May 5th, 1774. We found the frost event in the tree rings, and then I contacted Carrie Mock, an environmental historian who specializes in frost killing events. And he said, oh, go look in the Moravian diaries. They wrote everything down, and we were We were looking for 1774, and sure enough, they said this is the worst frost event we've ever experienced in the 25 years we've been here. And so the combination of severe drought and then a severe frost after an early spring set off a mortality event that was synchronous ecologically for 5 years at a large scale. That goes entirely against what I was taught. Well, I was taught that forests are asynchronous in their dynamics over time and space. And so if you have a synchronous mortality event triggered by climate change, that means our forests can change with climate in terms of structure and maybe composition. And it's not a big deal in 2024 to think that. But when I was a grad student 20 years ago, the senior scientists, ecologists, not all of them, but some of them would go to conferences and say, climate doesn't matter to our forests. And I'd be like, what? What are you? And I still hear it a little bit. It's changing, and the younger scientists don't believe this anymore. But we found a large scale event in the lifetimes of living trees that reshape some forests. We could take pollen from sediment cores and lakes, and we can see these big changes in the forest every few thousand years. But we're documenting a change only 250 years ago. It's not that long ago. It's long ago to you and I, but it's not long ago to a tree. And we found, I think, more events like that. We also found that there's a recruitment event, so trees coming into the forest between 1660 and 1680 at very large scales. We've documented it in buildings that early settlers cut down trees to build these places in the late 1700s, early 1800s. We have found it in early collections from old growth forests from the 1930s and 40s. Those samples are preserved. Florence Holly made these collections, an early tree ring scientist, the first woman tree ring scientist that we know of in North America, at least in the US. Her collections from old growth forests decades ago, almost a century ago now, say the same thing as the coring collections we made in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, that there was this big recruitment event. And I have colleagues who've tested this idea twice, and they keep coming up to this same conclusion. And so the theory that our forests are quasi-equilibrium and stable at large scales over long periods of time might not be true. It might be more complicated than that. And the discovery that I and my team made is 10 years ago now. That was only because the tree ring community created the International Tree Ring Data Bank and put all their tree ring records online and made it available to everyone. So I benefited from the work of others. And I just analyzed the data just a little differently as an ecologist rather than reconstructing climate. And I found this event. And so I believe even cross dating can help us change theory and our understanding of how the world works.
So basically what you do is you core a tree and you have the tree rings or the density, and you compare it to, for example, temperature that you have for the last 20, 30 years, or when we have measurements, and then you go back to before we had measurements. But a lot is happening there. You have temperature, you have drought, you have frost, you have insect. How do you disentangle all those effects just from tree rings?
Right now, we use a very simple technique of replication. More trees helps to reduce all that. It's very true that trees are impacted by many different things simultaneously. And all those factors, as we had sort of talked about, influence the width of tree rings. And so when we make reconstructions of climate, sometimes we're only explaining 40 to 60, if we're good, 70% of the year-to-year change. There's a lot of information, probably from the causes you're talking about, that impact the quality and the precision of our reconstruction. So these reconstructions are the best we can do right now. They're not perfect. Biology and ecology is really difficult. So it's primarily through replication. And I want to walk you through this because I think it's really important. It's 20 trees in a forest, or 40 if we can afford that time. And then it's dozens of populations in a region. And once you start combining those records statistically and de-emphasizing the disturbances and de-emphasizing the impact of geometry on ring width, because geometry of a tree influences how wide a ring is. And all these other factors, eventually the common signal, which we suggested to through cross dating, gets a little cleaner or becomes more apparent, becomes stronger. What Ed Cook knew and what I eventually started to show is when you use different species, and it's easier here than it is in Europe and other parts of the world, where I found that if you had 10 different tree species to reconstruct drought north of New York City, even if I took the chronologies of each species that were some of the weakest in terms of their response to drought, but I put them together, they made a very good drought reconstruction. So if I took the worst of the worst, sort of, I don't mean to dismiss trees. I would never dismiss trees. But if we took the worst of the worst, but we had many species, we got a better reconstruction. And so it's the ecology and the sensitivity to insects and temperature and water and all the other factors that influence trees that kind of gets filtered out when you increase species in your reconstruction. Now, of course, science is always progressing. People are using isotopes, carbon isotopes, oxygen isotopes, and they're not perfect, but they're in some ways they are. Oxygen isotopes are complicated. I don't do that work too much. But carbon isotopes I know are getting better, and they're actually making good reconstructions of drought using just the ratio of carbon 14 to carbon 12 in the tree rings. And then, of course, the wood anatomy that I hinted at a few minutes ago, that's being explored as climate proxies, an approximation of past climate. And so those proxies, the approximation of past climate, are starting to turn out as our tools and our understanding get better to be better than ring width. And there are ways to avoid, not avoid, to reduce all these other complicated factors. Our tree ring records are not perfect. We're always working to make them better. And there's nonlinearities that tree rings are getting hammered in the literature. It's not like we didn't know this. We've known this for, I bet you, a century, but at least 60 years now. It's not a new understanding, but we're now creating tools to improve on when we do that, on how to handle all the complicated processes that influence tree growth. But there's a lot of room for improvement. I would say though that one of the things that I think we do pretty well, it's not perfect yet, with these reconstructions, whether they're ecological like mine or climate reconstructions, is we go into history books and diaries and we're like, was this a dry year in 1166 in Eastern Europe? And sure enough, someone wrote about it, and sure enough, the tree rings are like, yeah, I didn't grow much that year, and we do that for frost events and ecological disturbances, and like I suggested with the 1774 ring. And so we work hard. We can always do more, but I think some of us work really hard to make attribution better, and that's using observational records or digging up a diary of 40 years of precipitation, from 1387 in England or something like that. There's a lot of ways that we work hard to try to ensure that what we're reconstructing is the best it can be. But, ultimately science is a human endeavor and humans are somewhat limited sometimes.
One question when you said about you combine multiple species to get a reconstruction. Am I right in assuming that, for example, two species have a similar trend, for example, a smaller tree ring, and one species is more sensitive to drought, so the ring is even smaller, so it's probably drought. Is that what you do?
Yeah. I think that's generally it. When Ed started doing this in the Eastern United States, and I'm focusing on the Eastern United States because dendrochronology was formalized in the Western arid region. And I know there was dendrochronology going back in Europe, going back 100 and at least 1840s, right? And probably much, much longer. So I'm sorry, I don't know the early history of dendrochronology and across Europe. But in the eastern United States, when Ed Cook reconstructed drought in the 1970s, that was a really big deal because they didn't think in this wetter environment, the trees would be responsive to drought. And so he proved it, he showed it that we could do it. And so he was just coring trees and testing species that were long lived because he wanted long records. And then he would compare them to the instrumental record, and he would find the trees that responded to drought more than others. So we don't use eastern white pine, Pinus strobus, to reconstruct drought using ring widths. Someone maybe has. I haven't. Ed doesn't, because they're just not a reliable responder. But Ed found, and then I and others have started coring other species, and we're finding that other species are very sensitive. Now their sensitivity is different. And so in the paper that I sort of hinted about, where I showed that multiple species reconstruct drought better than a few number of species, in there, I created a table that showed how well individual trees respond. Hemlock, tulip poplar, which is the Dendron tulipifera, which is one of my favorite trees, respond really well to drought conditions. Black tupelo or Nyssa sylvatica is very weak. But when you statistically combine their records and you extract using, principal component analysis or other methods, when we extract the common pattern of growth over time, every species contributes. And I haven't thought about it. That's a really interesting question, actually. I don't know how each species contributes, but they contribute statistically. We can check that and we can monitor it, we can quantify it. And together, they make a better tree ring record. And whether it's because, let's say that one year is kind of dry, and let's say the red oaks experienced something and they didn't grow less that year, but the sweet birch in the same region responded slightly differently. They didn't respond to what the red oak did, but they responded differently. They responded to like the shortage of water. When you put them together, they both are saying, yeah, it was a drier year. It was less for black birch maybe than, I'm just speculating. I don't really know. But there's something, it's the idea of the sum is greater than the whole of the parts, right? And so there is something synthetic that emerges. There's an emergent property that we probably haven't explored enough to understand why. But I think it's the different sensitivities and the different life history events in different forests help us reduce again those other signals, those other impacts that would change the response to drought. But that's a really good question of how do they contribute? Because it would seem like, since we know that eastern hemlock and tulip poplar are two of the best trees to reconstruct drought, why don't we only use those? But my analysis suggested it's not as good as using 10 different species.
And what have you learned about trees from dendrochronology that you wouldn't have learned otherwise?
That's a really good question, because I still can't believe I've done the research that I've done and I'm at where I'm at. Because when I was a second year student in college, I thought I was going to be a math teacher, and and a coach. And that was my goal. And I took this class about how humans were altering the earth. And it was really cheesy. And in England, they would say it was cheeky. It was really cheeky, but it would move me. I was young, and I was like, oh, I want to learn about how I can restore forests. And so I started falling in love with trees as a student. My goal was learning about trees and learning about which ones would be better to restore damaged landscapes. That's what got me into trees. And then I took dendrology, the study of trees, with Don Leopold, and he is still a great teacher. And I just fell in love with trees. And for the next 4 or 5 years, I was tracking this disturbance ecology, restoration ecology, disturbance in forests idea, and I kept coming into tree rings, and I resisted it. I was not going to do dendrochronology when I was a junior in college. I learned about it. The teacher was the nicest person, you know, but they were not the most interesting teacher. Let's just put it that way. And I was like, I am never going to do dendrochronology. I still remember the classroom and the desk and the teacher. Like I said to myself, I will never do this in my life. And here I am. And it's because I learned what the power of tree rings were. And then in the last 25 years, come back to the beginning of the conversation. I've learned that trees are so much more resilient, so much more capable, so much more plastic, so much more active from their rings, from their memories, from what's preserved in the rings from year to year over centuries. And I've just come to admire trees and what they can tolerate. When people ask me to come look at a tree because they think it's sick and they think it might fall down, do they need to cut it? 98% of the time I go, looks fine. Trees are amazing. They don't want to hear that because they're worried about it, and the arborist won't say that. But trees have taught me that one of the things I worry the least about is the lives of trees. We can manage forests better. We can steward forests better. We could not spread pests and pathogens around the world like we are. That's a real threat. But once trees are established, if we are living gracefully with them, I don't worry about trees. I don't even worry about them so much with the climate crisis, because evolutionarily, they've seen a lot of this. Now, they may have not seen a temperature change so quickly. It's really going to be hard on them. But trees have taught me nothing in the last 20 years, if not resilience of their lives and their ability to overcome things that you and I can't imagine, things that our grandparents couldn't imagine, things that happened in the past that, until recently were unbelievable. Insect outbreaks, fires, and warming. And we are changing forests in ways that are not good. But trees are just amazing. And understanding their lives and looking at their rings and how they survived and how it violates so many assumptions we have about them. I think I still have trouble articulating what I think, but they're amazing. And I love this moment in time, how trees and forests have never been more popular in my lifetime. I love it. I love that trees are getting written about in books. The adoration for trees is just amazing. And I'm just loving it. They deserve it. The plankton make most of the oxygen in the world. It's hard as a tree person to admit that, but I know it's true. It's a fact. But what trees have done for us, there's an idea out there that we learn to walk in the tops of trees, not on savannas. And I don't know if that's true. I look forward to the research. But the point of this book, it's called The Age of Wood. I highly recommend it. It's tree centric, and it makes a very compelling argument that trees are extremely important for the evolution of humans. Maybe since we've lived in the tops of trees, but especially over the last 500 or 600 or thousands of years. Fuel, shelter, paper, you know, what trees do so much for. Oh, and aesthetics and life and beauty and habitat for the animals that we live in and some of the animals we depend upon. And the study of tree rings and learning about their lives only makes that idea in my mind even stronger. We might not appreciate trees until recently as much as we should, right? There's the Bronze Age and the Iron's Age and all those Stone Age and all that. There were trees there all the time as tools making that happen. But they decay and they burn and they're gone. So there aren't records. You've got really old buildings in Europe and old ships that can attest to that. But that's only 1,000 years. What about the previous, 100,000 years? Trees were always there for humans.
I feel like I almost don't have to ask anymore, but still, do you have a take-home message for our listeners?
Yeah, I like this question a lot. And, I am very aware of the ongoing climatic, ecological, and biological crises that are happening in the world. And I am an optimist, as I think I just said about nature. Some of that was spending time at a geologic institute and learning about Earth history over the last few million years. And you go, That really happened? Oh my gosh. There were glaciers at what latitude? In the, at 10 degrees? Like what? Snowball Earth? What are you talking about? Like I couldn't believe it because I was just an ecologist at that time. So I'm really optimistic about nature. And so I think what I want to say, kind of wrap this up, is I am painfully aware of how things are changing. Where I live in Massachusetts in the Northeastern United States reminds me of when I moved to Alabama in 1991. Like our weather is becoming like the weather of the Southeastern United States 30 years ago. And it's shocking to me, shocking. We don't have winters like we used to. And so I'm very concerned about that. I'm concerned about, all the vulnerable people who don't have agency, who don't have political, financial power to get out of the way of pollution, blazing temperatures, wildfires. The heat waves in India just painful to read about. And I think about all the people that live there, and so and then the impacts it's going to have in our agricultural system, and the impacts we're having in the oceans that we feed ourselves with. But I'm naively optimistic still. I believe there are solutions, and I want people to not fall into the doomerism that dominates newspapers, media, and some parts of our culture. It's very easy to fall into that, and I fight it myself. But like I was saying just a couple minutes ago, my love for trees brought me into this scientific career, and then my love for trees brought me to Turkey and Russia and China and Mongolia and Argentina and a few parts of Europe. Finally, I got to go do research in Europe, which was one of the latest ones. And then my wife, I'm not a traveler as much as my wife is. And so I got to go to Peru and see Machu Picchu and see what the Incans built, 400 years ago. And so all of this to say, I'm very fortunate to have traveled to all these places and to meet people of different cultures and learn more about the histories of their culture and then seeing the great works of their culture. So I went to Sichuan province to core trees that are sort of similar to what we have in the Northeast or the Eastern United States. And as a part of that, my host said, "Do you want to go see the irrigation project?" And I was like, "Irrigation project? This doesn't sound very appealing." But as a guest in another country, I said, "Yes, I would like to see the irrigation project." Like that's the least I can do as a guest. Honor your culture. Show me what you want to show me. Well, it turns out that Li Bing and his son, and probably 100 other people, designed an irrigation system that could capture the Asian monsoon to control flooding, to irrigate fields, and to manage water better. It was built 2,000 years ago. And what I was told that there's only been a couple adjustments to this project done over the last 2,000 years. Let's say that that's not correct. Let's say that's 10 adjustments. But if you can learn how to manage the Asian monsoon and flooding and drought that come with it, that's incredible, right? That's equal to building the pyramids, building Machu Picchu, learning all the plants of the world so you can take care of diseases. And so you can build antibiotics. So you can take the hearts out of people and replace them with something else. The human intellect over time across all cultures is incredible. That should not even be an argument. And hopefully it's not an argument. And if it's not an argument, then we apply it to us today. If we put our collective minds to it and our will and our money, we can solve. And we can quibble over the word solve, but we can address a lot of these issues and make a better world for everyone. I firmly believe that because I've seen the proof of it. It's all around the world. We take it for granted. Rivers in the United States used to burn around the time I was born. We solved it. Rivers don't burn anymore. We stopped the pollution. We took care of things. We can do it again. I'm positive of it. Positive.
Thank you so much for this hopeful take-home message. This was Apple Finch Pudding. I want to thank Neil Pederson for the information. Let's meet again for the next episode of Apple Finch Pudding.